Well, I'm not alcoholic because I haven't gotten a DUI. I haven't been put in jail. I haven't thrown up at a party, but I was personally miserable. You can choose to quit drinking before you hit a terrible bottom. That bottom was low enough. It was emotionally crushing.
Welcome to Flood for Love of Recovery, where I'm your host, Dominique Zager. Sibling relationships can be so unique, but they can become more complex when there's drug or alcohol use involved. If you find yourself questioning how to help, you're not alone. Every month, we bring together stories that empower you to better navigate your sibling's addiction, offer a sense of connection, and provide fresh perspectives on understanding substance use and how to protect your peace. Join me on this journey in restoring hope and healing. In our last episode, we talked about the complexities, grief, and acceptance surrounding sibling estrangement. In this episode, we're getting into what it looks like to rebuild those relationships and reconnect after addiction and limited contact. Today, we have Janice Johnson Dowd, a licensed social worker, person in recovery from alcohol use, and the author of the book, Rebuilding Relationships in Recovery. Janice will share her personal story and professional expertise on the challenges of repairing relationships strained by addiction, and she'll share guidance on how families can reconnect with compassion and hope. Janice, thank you so much for being on the show today. I'd love for you to start off with sharing a little bit about your personal story.
As you mentioned, I am a recovering alcoholic. I am the mother of 4. I'm a social worker by training, and now I'm a author, speaker, writer. I grew up in an alcoholic home, so I consider myself an adult child of an alcoholic. I didn't drink much as a young person because of that, and because I emerged from that family very codependent and very much with all the early traits of an adult child of an alcoholic. So I like to say, instead of becoming an alcoholic, I became a social worker. I think a lot of us who grow up in dysfunctional families tend to go in the helping field, and that's exactly what I did. So I was very committed. My passion was helping adolescents and families, 30 years ago. And I worked in the drug and alcohol field for about 10 years before I got married and started having children, and then took a part-time job that was less demanding. And during all of that time, I was not a big drinker. We didn't have alcohol in our house. I had some good self-care skills from being a social worker. I always believed in therapy and going to 12-step meetings, all of that. But once I was done having children, so in my early 40s, I started to drink socially, and gradually that increased until I was a full-blown alcoholic, and I went to treatment at age 52. The progression from a social drinker to alcoholic was full of denial and guilt and shame, because I grew up in that family, and I swore to myself really early on that I would never become an alcoholic or put my kids through what I went through. I told myself that I'm too smart, too wise. I'll be able to control my drinking. Look, I did it for 20 years. But I really believe in the disease concept and the genetic influence. And between not taking as good care of myself, the stressors of life, having 4 small children, I started drinking, and I ended up in treatment. I tried, before I went to treatment, every other way to fix myself because of the guilt and shame and embarrassment. But I ended up in treatment, and it was the turning point of something really great.
It's a lot to have to deal with, especially when you're not expecting to go down that route, or you feel like you've been trying to do whatever you could that's in your power to actually prevent this one thing from occurring. What was one of the telltale signs that your social drinking was becoming problematic? And when did your family or social circle begin to realize that something was wrong?
That's a great question. My social circle kind of evolved with me. Literally, I remember drinking at night with my girlfriends, watching reality TV and enjoying that. And it progressed to like lunches out Your kids are all finally in school. You have daytime to yourself. So it really crept up slowly. I would say the turning point in my drinking came when both of my parents became ill and I had to take care of them. And I found myself drinking alone, spiking my Diet Cokes and my beverages while sitting next to my dad in his hospital room because, well, it was my way of coping. So I was doing a lot of drinking alone. I'm not blaming that event for pushing me over. If anything, it was helped me to realize that, oh my God, I'm drinking a lot and I'm going to cut back. And I did cut back for a while, but no, it just increased from there. I tried to fix myself through like counseling and anti-anxiety medication, all kinds of stuff during the last 2 years of my drinking. I go to bed thinking, okay, I'm not going to drink tomorrow, or I won't drink until after the kids are in bed. And I couldn't do it. So that was the real awareness that I had a problem. Ultimately, my therapist recommended I try 12-step groups, and I knew all about AA. And I knew it was free, and I knew you could go to open meetings. So I started to go to AA. And that was when I really began to surrender, hearing other people's stories and seeing my life was becoming unmanageable. Well, it ruined my drinking because you can't keep making excuses. So I was in denial a lot too. I think this is important to say because I never got a DUI. I didn't have any real significant health issues. I didn't perceive significant family problems, though they were there, but I would blame them on other things, not necessarily my drinking. So I didn't have all the common things. And that was what I clung to towards the end. Like, well, I'm not alcoholic because I haven't gotten a DUI. I haven't been put in jail. I haven't thrown up at a party, but I was personally miserable. You can choose to quit drinking before you hit a terrible bottom. That bottom was low enough. It was emotionally crushing. Once I got sober, I saw that I was experiencing bigger problems than I would have recognized at the time. And part of that was just the cyclical drinking behavior, drinking to deal with the guilt, trying to moderate, that whole cycle.
The justified drinking sounds like it makes it a little bit challenging to see outside perspectives other than what we're doing day in and day out. And I'd want to know a little bit more about what was the outside perception like? Was there any kind of added pressure from your family? I know you mentioned your children were younger at the time. Your social circle, was there any kind of questioning around why is Janice in this situation? Shouldn't she know how to, quote, fix her own problems if, she's a professional? What was some of the outside influences in your recovery and ultimately attending AA for the first time?
Well, I didn't have a whole lot of pressure from outside influences because I involved myself with the other moms who drank at lunch. At the soccer games and the soccer tournaments, I hung out with the parents who drank. There's that group of parents that go to the restaurant afterwards and they sit at one table and they drink. And then there's the group of parents that sit at the table closer to the kids and they supervise the kids. So I put myself in social situations where it was socially acceptable to drink. The pressure, I think, came mostly from my now ex-husband and gradually from my kids, especially when I first started going to AA. So I tried AA for 3 months before I was intervened on. At first, I was slow to tell my husband and my kids. And honestly, I'm just having this realization as I think about it. I think I used it as an excuse to buy time with them. I'm like, I'm really trying. I promise you I'm trying. I've been to 5 meetings this week. Like, just bear with me. Because my kids stagger in age. So during those last years of my drinking, I almost always had a student driver or someone to carpool the kids, thankfully. So I can't say that I never drove drunk, but I pretty confident I never drove my kids drunk. So I remember one time my son driving himself and his little brother to school. He was 15. He had his learner's permit. And as he's getting out of the car, he looks at me because I'm sure I'm like hungover or looking bad from the night before. And he looks at me, he goes, "Are you okay to drive?" And my response was, "Of course. Been going to AA. I'm fine." It was just an excuse. I mean, I'm pretty sure I must have drank or, misbehaved, done something that made him suspicious. So the cues from my kids were subtle. They were not direct, not in my face. If anything, they probably did a little bit of walking on eggshells around me. Ignore the problem. She says she's trying. My oldest two were in college at the time. Katie, the younger of the two, my only daughter, is very much aware, and we butted heads. I remember over the Christmas holidays when she was home, we butt heads a good bit, and she was more confrontational. But honestly, I was pretty drunk at the time, so I don't remember a lot about it. I will validate her when she tells me about it, and definitely not deny or dismiss that situation and how difficult it was for her to confront me and for me to not be responsive to it.
Scary place to have to be in, one, hearing the experience from your kids, not remembering part of that story, but also knowing that your kids were very much aware of what was going on, at least to some degree, given their age, whether or not they really expressed that. Was there anything in particular that you wish your family or your kids knew about you or your addiction while you were actively using?
When my kids were little, I took a lot of pride in trying to break the cycle. My parents were good people. They did their best. They provided myself and my brothers a good home, education, structure, spirituality. But they also were from dysfunctional families. Both were impacted by alcoholism. So they never really role modeled what a healthy relationship was or a healthy parent-child relationship. Never learned how to really express feelings, communicate effectively, much less stand up to authority, because I was that little people pleaser, insecure kid from my family. So early in my career, and with my kids when they were really young, before I started drinking, I really prided myself on like trying to break that cycle and do a better job. I tried to educate them. I even remember having conversations about the dangers of doing shots when my older kids were going off to college. But I never really talked to them about what addiction looked like. I never talked to them about my father's alcoholism because we never discussed the disease concept. I wish that they could have gotten more support, understanding of the disease concept, so that one, they didn't feel like they had to walk on eggshells around me, that they were contributing to my disease, and so that they could see it as a disease. Everyone uses the comparison of alcoholism as a disease, just like diabetes or lung disease. I like to take that a step further. When you hear about a friend, a coworker's husband is diagnosed with cancer, you want to reach out to them. Most people are willing to share that and don't carry a lot of shame or embarrassment over the struggles that are accompanied to that. But when the disease that you're affected with is addiction, or the family of the addicted person doesn't tend to reach out, and that people on the outside, because of the stigma still associated, don't really know how to help out. That is part of the struggle with the disease. I think if we all understood that and could share about it, like my family hid it from their friends and outside influences and didn't get that kind of support. So I wish during my active addiction they could have gotten more support. My ex-husband did, as soon as I went to treatment, he did get them involved in counseling though, and I'm grateful for that. They had very, very limited involvement in the very limited family program at my treatment center, primarily because they live 4 hours away from my treatment center. And my ex-husband, we had 2 kids at home still who are very active in sports and extracurricular activities. So he was not only being dad provider, but wife, carpool, kitchen cook, house cleaner. It was difficult for us. So I wish they could have gotten more involved in my treatment.
Yeah, there's a lot of roles that we start to take on when there is a parent that might be missing from that relationship or from that household. When my brother was struggling, my mom was taking on all these different roles to help support him. And I love that you mentioned in your book, but also just now, that some treatment programs do involve the family and some treatment programs don't. Why would you think that sibling involvement would be particularly important for rebuilding those relationships? And do you feel that every family member needs to be involved in therapy for reconnection or healing to be successful?
Great questions. Siblings supporting each other, I think, is really important. It is a lonely, heartbreaking illness and disease, and to have people around you who are going through it with you is crucial. And then the second part of the question, in an ideal world, I would love for everyone to be involved in a treatment program. A lot of places offer 4 or 5 day intensive programs, which I love and was involved in early in my career and found that a great starting point. I recently went to a workshop about a family therapy program at a long-term treatment facility where they intentionally removed the family members. So I think it goes on a case-by-case basis. They did that because they wanted the family members to heal separately while the person in recovery heals, and then to reintroduce them. I still don't really like that. It's not my preference, but it's another treatment mode, which lends to the second part of the question. Different things for different people. I don't think everyone needs to be in therapy. Bottom line is this. For me to get and stay sober, I have to take complete responsibility. I have gone through a number of challenges in sobriety, and alienating myself from my kids is one of them. Making a lot of mistakes. I had to stay sober during that time regardless. So I'm not responsible for the genetic component, but I'm responsible for taking that first drink or that next drink. And two, I have to take responsibility for my recovery. I can't say, oh, I can't get sober because my mother won't quit drinking, which was not the issue. Mom, RIP. But, I can't blame it on someone else, or I can't get sober because I hate my job or the job is stressful. I have to learn to live life sober in that situation. Not everyone is ready for therapy, is ready to look for their part in it. I think education and information is important, can be presented, and that's why family programs are great because they're at least 50% information. So education, information is important, but therapy may not be the right step for everyone. It's like put out the fire first and then deal with what started the fire.
Absolutely. It's not just about going to counseling or going to therapy and just, showing up on a weekly basis, but really about the actions that you're taking in your personal life. You just alluded to it a little bit now, and you spoke about this in your book as well, around how you had to recognize that your life had become unmanageable. Can you share how you came to understand the impact that your addiction had on your family, or if you have siblings, and how that really helped or hindered your recovery process?
Oh my gosh. Another great question. At first, I was in denial about how bad my drinking was and how bad it impacted my kids. Definitely, because of the heavy drinking the last few months, believed that I experienced some brain fog. You could call it brain damage, but our prefrontal cortex is where we make decisions, and it's most impacted by alcohol or drugs. It took at least a year before that brain fog lifted enough that I could really look back and see things clearly. I also think that I transferred my addictive behavior from alcohol to recovery. I immersed myself so much into the recovery program that I alienated myself from my kids. And it took me till I was about 6 months sober before I could go, oh, wait, this is out of balance. I'm putting all this energy into recovery and nothing into my family of origin, and I'm creating bigger problems there. It took time for the clarity to come before I could really see that.
What were some of the initial changes and actions that you or your family took to rebuild the relationship? What was it like regaining some kind of contact, rebuilding those relationships with your kids, your ex-husband, or whoever else you had in your life?
Well, from 12 weeks of treatment, I went to a halfway house. From a halfway house, which was all located 4 hours from home, I went to a sober living home. I got kicked out of my halfway house when I was 6 months sober for something I didn't do. And that was the eye-opening experience. It ended up being the best thing ever. But at the time, it was the worst thing because I just recently had a marital counseling appointment with my husband, which had gone disastrously. Like that counseling appointment had been on a Friday, got kicked out on a Sunday. He had made it clear that if I ever drank or used again, he would take the kids and leave, which was the big threat and on why I went to treatment. That was the ultimate intervention. And so when I got kicked out, I was like, I can't tell him. Oh my God, this is the worst thing ever. And once you leave a halfway house, you're no longer allowed to have any contact with those people. They were not even allowed to talk to me at like AA meetings. So I had most of my support system ripped out for me. I still had my therapist, my primary sponsor, and I had 2 temporary sponsors. I really finally realized how desperate my situation was, that I had removed myself from my family. All along, I'd been sending, almost as if it was a chore, a weekly letter to my kids. I had not been trying to call them or text them. And I was doing that because I was so afraid of being rejected. A letter was, in my mind, at least I'm doing something. When I eventually got home, they stopped opening those letters because they were very superficial and meaningless to them and had no real content or weight. But to answer your question, I just started trying. And I became willing to risk rejection, which is why I had limited my contact with them up until then. I was so afraid of being rejected and abandoned by them. I distanced myself from my brothers, with my siblings. When I went to treatment, I didn't even call my mother or any of my siblings. Asked my husband to do that because they live far away. I do think I hid most of my drinking from them. My brother has expressed it was kind of a surprise at first that I'd gone to treatment. They're like, when does she drink? I did the same thing with my siblings. I distanced myself from them, did not return home to Texas for the first year of my recovery. I limited my phone calls, but I never explained myself. That's one of the things I wish I could have done because it took till my mom got sick and died for me to really realize what great resources they could have been. We 3 came together in a way that, man, if I would have reached out and said, I need help, it would have been nice to know I still had my siblings.
There's a lot of layers of shame and guilt and fear of rejection. If you are rebuilding your relationships with your siblings, do you think it's possible to do that if the other person is not in recovery? Is there any way that the siblings can support the person who is actively using if they're not ready?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's important because it's an isolating disease to let your loved one know that you'll be there for them when they're ready to get help, that you might physically have to set boundaries, emotionally have to set boundaries. And as an addict or alcoholic, we're probably going to just feel rejected. But there's that little seed that you've planted, like, once I get my act together, you're going to be there for me. I'm really not going to be alone forever. So to leave that seed of hope, continue to be supportive. Set limits, set boundaries. Above all, take care of yourself, get education, information. Listen to people whose stories have been through what you're going through to give you some hope. For instance, so when I was feeling very hopeless, like I'm never going to earn my kids' love back, I actively sought out people in my sober community who'd been through what I'd been through. There's this man, Eddie, who had 4 daughters, who was very helpful in getting me into sober living. He recently celebrated like his 38th AA birthday. And I went up, and I had the opportunity to say, you made such a difference in my early recovery. At 6 months, you helped me find a place and you helped give me hope that you were able to repair the relationships with your 4 daughters that maybe I could too. And we both teared up. It was a great moment for both of us. But the point being, I sought out someone. And from a sibling point of view, too, you can seek out stories of people who wanted to give up on their brother or sister or cousin or mother or father. And then ultimately it worked out. I gave up on my dad. I thought my dad would never get sober. And he did. He did because the doctor told him that his dementia was going to get worse if he didn't quit drinking. So he quit drinking at like the age of, God, I'd have to think, sometime in his 60s.
It's interesting because it's like there's a lot of important things that you're bringing up. There's so many questions I want to ask. And one of the important things that you're hitting is the power of connection, whether it's like, having your own community as a sibling, as a parent, as a person in recovery.
Absolutely. Community is everything. I mean, that's when I felt hopeless, I embraced that my friend and my peer at the meeting had hope. So I'm like, I'll borrow some of yours. And that helps you know that you're not alone, that there's other people out there going through it.
Absolutely. One of the things I want to touch on is how your relationships with your children and your family, your ex-husband has evolved over time. Now that you've been in recovery for several years, what are some of the helpful things that your family has done to support you? And what do you think were some of those big changes?
This question comes up a lot. Probably the most helpful thing is that in early recovery, they weren't afraid to call me out on my stuff. Now, that was not true for each of them. It was definitely true for my ex-husband, and I can't share too much about our journey, but I can about my daughter because our relationship has really evolved, and she has always been to speak up for herself and to call things like she sees it. So she would call me out on stuff. And I think from family members' point of views and siblings' point of view, often we're like, I get this question, but should I tell them that I see them regressing? Or should I tell them that this behavior, should I walk on eggshells? I don't want to stress them out anymore. Well, tell them the truth. Holding back is not helpful for anyone. So I think one of the big things that they did that was helpful was, and Katie wasn't always, sorry, Katie, gentle in confronting me. Matthew, my middle son, is great at gently confronting me. They're all good at confronting me now and calling me out my stuff. But I think that's an important part. Being patient with your loved one is really important. Be careful with your expectations. I know this from more of a professional point of view. We think, and Katie said this in a podcast recently, you think that when your family member gets sober, they've flipped a switch and that everything's going to go back to normal, or you want to see things improve. And it doesn't work that way. I am still wacky. And when I'm tired, I fall back on insecurity. And my daughter recently called me out on falling back on self-pity, which was really painful to hear, but true. So you got to monitor those expectations. I'm never going to be June Cleaver, thank goodness. But the change is going to be up and down. I think a really important thing to remember is that when they've removed that drug or alcohol, which is their primary coping mechanism, all their feelings are raw, and we don't have good tools for dealing with it. So doesn't mean walk on eggshells around us. It just means be prepared for some mood swings.
Right. That makes sense. I have those conversations with my brother, and he's very ambivalent about wanting to go to treatment. We were actually on the phone yesterday. I was explaining to him, I was like, Justin, the first thing is just starting to remove some of those drugs from your system so you can begin to learn how to exist without them. The second step is really going to be maybe even harder because now you're learning how to deal with all those emotions and experiences and trauma in a way that doesn't involve any kind of substance. And I think that's where the real work comes. You've removed the coping mechanism, and now the real work is just starting. I think that's something that a lot of families might be unsure about is, oh, well, this person, they're no longer using. And things should be fine now. It's like, that's not true. Like the substance might be removed, but there are all these other layers of complexity that your loved one still has to work through. Right. And, especially if they're living in the home or if, you guys are very close, there's a lot of other dynamics that have to change too, not necessarily just that one person to be able to support their recovery and ultimately rebuild the relationship to a place where everyone is feeling better about it.
You mentioned family roles before. It took a while for the family roles to adapt to the person in active addiction. It's going to take equally as long for you to adapt to the person in recovery, especially if that person wants to take back on, which some of us do. We go through these pink cloud periods and we think, all right, now I'm going to quit smoking, lose weight, improve my marriage, go back to school. You set these unrealistic expectations for you and your family too. Or it might just even be, I'm going to cook dinner every night. And your kids will be like, wait a second, we want to eat Taco Bell and Burger King every night. We're not used to cooking dinner. I mean, it could be something as simple as that throws off the balance of the family, and everyone's got to adapt to it. So absolutely. I will say this. I love the idea of longer term treatment because for me personally, as I got that first 12 weeks of treatment, I uncovered trauma and things that I had pushed down. So I needed that support system to deal with that stuff, to continue to work on it after those first 12 weeks. So the 12-week program that I went to was mostly involved in professionals, military, doctors, lawyers, nurses, people who had licenses they wanted to earn back or maintain. And part of getting that back was being accountable, drug tests, things like that. And I have to say, of all the people that I went to treatment with who participated in those programs, who continued to be accountable, they're sober today, which beats the odds. I mean, the odds of, relapse is very prevalent. Many people go to treatment multiple times. I only went to treatment once. I attribute my success largely to my commitment to the long term and the success of my peers back there to the long term involvement. Yeah. So that's my shout out for long term. And it doesn't have to be one of my best friends in treatment, who was a pharmacist. She ended up staying like 13, 14 weeks. So she did her extended stay, returned home, but had an intensive outpatient program that she had to stay in. She had this huge accountability over her for like the first 2 years of her recovery. So it doesn't necessarily have to be 6 months of inpatient treatment or halfway house, but some type of ongoing therapy support.
Yeah, it sounds like, having that support system, when you're in treatment is going to be super important, but then also thinking about how you're going to maintain that support system, either once you come home or like you said, if you're in an intensive outpatient program or whatnot, is having some kind of plan. For people who are coming out of treatment, or maybe they've been sober for a couple of months now, and there's still some skepticism with their family or their loved ones, and they're, not necessarily sure who this version of their loved one that they're getting, right? What kind of suggestions would you give to them around approaching either their loved one's sobriety, welcoming them, or just overall adjusting to this new normal?
Oh my gosh. Patience, compassion for themselves first, because as a family member, you're often overlooked. We overlook you. We forget how we've hurt you. We get so wrapped up in at least this is my experience, and our own self-pity that we forget that we've hurt you and that you're hurting too. First thing is you got to take care of yourself and find your own community, and then be patient with us. Call us out tactfully on our stuff. Don't set up really high expectations because we're going to be all over the place.
What are some tips for calling someone out for the first time, or maybe they've called them out 100 times and they're tired of saying the same thing over and over? I'm sure a lot of people feel like a broken record when it comes to their loved one, whether it's their sibling, their spouse, their child, whomever it might be.
If what you're doing you've done before and it hasn't worked, don't do it. Try something different. Be specific. Be short. stick to I statements. One of my favorite tools is if you're confronting someone on their behavior, you can say, when you do this, I feel this, if you want to express your feelings. So when you yell at the dog, I get triggered into that old feeling that you're going to turn and yell at me next. I know that the two don't have anything to do together. So how can we work on this? This is not just a you problem. I have to own how I feel about it. This is a us problem. Let's work on this together. So, or I see this happening. Am I right? Am I wrong?
One of the things that I've found, like asking open-ended questions, but also asking questions that sometimes where maybe you're arguing fact. It's like, though you said that you would do A, B, and C. It's been X amount of time and A, B, and C still has not happened. Why do you think that is? Or what kind of changes are you willing to make to help make A, B, and C happen? I think allowing that person to come up with a conclusion on their own has been helpful. It's been particularly helpful with my brother because he is younger. It's allowing him to come up with the answer on his own rather than being told from an authoritative figure, this is what you need to do and this is why it's not working. And has anyone like called you out using those kinds of questions or pointing out to specific action?
This past weekend, when Katie called me out on falling back into self-pity, we both could have handled that situation better because I was quick to get defensive as opposed to hear what she said. God, I'm processing this as we're talking. I did try this the other night. We're getting heated. The conversation's going nowhere. Let's table it and come back to that, which works for me, but doesn't always work for the other person because they're like, no, I want to resolve this, you know?
One that I really love that you bring up in the book is this emphasis on understanding someone's motivation before you take action. And why do you think that's particularly helpful when trying to rebuild a relationship with someone who is in recovery from addiction?
I'm really big on the tool SNAP too, where you stop, you notice what you're thinking, feeling related to a statement. You ask yourself, is it true? Here's another great example. Katie and I love to travel. We went to Italy and it drove her crazy that I didn't want to try all the food. It became a conflict. And it took me slowing down to realize I was getting defensive because growing up, my mom had this issue with over-serving. So for Katie to push me and kind of tease me, even though it wasn't out of line, I overreacted to it. So my behavior in snapping back wasn't about her and me. It was about that old family history of like, I hate people pushing food on me. And so if you understand what's behind that defense, maybe you can put it in perspective.
Knowing what you know today, are there any last reminders or thoughts that you think it's really important for siblings and their families to know when they're trying to either help themselves or cope with someone else's addiction?
I think the number one way to help yourself is to get community support and education and information. Personally, I feel better the more information I get. Give yourself some compassion, love, support, give yourself a break, and get as much information, education as you can. Don't lose hope. There are people who lose their battle to addiction, but I want to give people hope that it's a possibility. The success rate is overwhelmingly better than the failure rate. And it may take 2, 3, 10 times. And that's okay. That's okay.
Absolutely. Everyone's recovery is going to look very different. And I think comparing one person's recovery to another's is unfair to them, but it's also, it gives you this false expectation of what it should look like rather than seeing where the person is in their progress. With that being said, Janice, thank you so much for coming on to the show today, sharing your personal story, your relationship with your family, and your professional perspective. And if anybody who's listening would like to pick a copy of Janice's book, Rebuilding Relationships in Recovery, you can find the link in the description. Thanks for listening to this episode of For Love of Recovery. If you enjoyed this episode or know somebody who might, please leave a comment and share it. You can also join our Facebook group, Siblings for Love of Recovery, if you're looking to have deeper conversations around your siblings' use of drugs or alcohol. And remember, where there is hope, there is healing.